California. The purpose of your trip tomorrow?
Just to see the firefighters. Nobody's ever seen what's going on over there. And now they're saying it could be as many as 600. This just came out before we met. It could be as many as 600 people killed, up by 400. It's incredible what's going on, and burned beyond recognition. They can't even see the bodies. It's incredible.
President Trump heading to California tomorrow, as you said, just to see the firefighters. In his interview with Chris Wallace of Fox News to air Sunday, the president confuses there the number of missing people, which had stood at 600, with the number of fatalities, which sadly now stands at 71. Since that interview, the number of missing has now grown to over 1,000. He also returns to his theme of blaming California. It was, after all, his first response to these fires. Remember, he's apparently been led to believe it's bad management of state lands. Today, he seemed to blame the fires, at least in part, on a lack of preemptive raking of underbrush.
I was watching the firemen the other day, and they were raking areas. They were raking areas where the fire was right over there, and they're raking trees, little trees like this that are not trees, little bushes that you could see are totally dry. Weeds. And they're raking them. They're on fire. That should have been all raked out.
What about the argument?
You wouldn't have the fires.
What about the argument it's climate change, that it's drier, it's hotter, and that that's contributing to it?
Maybe it contributes a little bit. The big problem we have is management.
You heard him there. That should have been all raked out in advance. We should note the head of the firefighters union called the president's mismanagement charges irresponsible, reckless, and insulting. And their Pasadena local told the president directly, "You are wrong." Only 3% of California woodlands are run by the state of California. It's just one chapter in this presidency, but it's enough to discuss tonight with the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and presidential historian Jon Meacham. His latest work is The Soul of America, and as far as we're concerned, he is. So, John, talk about presidents and empathy. I heard Sarah Huckabee Sanders, interviewed by her dad tonight on Fox News, say that this trip to California, and this was notable, she said this will be one of the hardest trips of the presidency thus far, as if she was trying to apply qualities of emotion and empathy to her boss.
Yeah, you know, I've always been careful not to rush to judgment and to say that there's no way the president will change or grow in office, because our greatest presidents have, in fact, changed and grown. And you never want to be shut yourself off from the possibility of redemption and growth. But I think we're pretty much past the possibility of redemption and growth here. The presidents who we remember, the ones we want to commemorate, the ones we want to emulate, are the ones who have, in fact, signaled that they cared about what was unfolding in the country, what was happening to our people, and also those who were able to learn from experience. Woodrow Wilson said, even before he became president, that the president of the United States, by law and custom, has the capacity to be as big a man as he can. And President Trump has repeatedly turned out to be as small as he possibly can. He points fingers instead of opening his arms. He fails, I think, repeatedly to rise to the occasion. He never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and I suspect this weekend will fall into that pattern.
You know the story, and I've discussed it with Michael Beschloss on this broadcast. Post-hurricane, Louisiana, no power. Yeah. Lyndon Johnson climbs on a berm with a flashlight in his hand, shines it up from his chin, and says to the people within the sound of his voice, "This is your president." And that was a kind of the custodial role, the bigness of the job in a small venue.
Johnson also said that nothing opens the soul of a man the way the presidency does, that all the concerns, all the cares of the people become his cares and his concerns. George W. Bush really became president on that Friday in September after the attacks. He gives that very formal, remarkable speech in the cathedral, and then he flies to Ground Zero, and he's standing on the rubble and is among those first responders. And if you talk to President Bush about it, it was very much about wanting to prove to those men and women who were covered in the soot of death that he was with them and he found his voice. President Trump has simply, I don't even think he's really tried, honestly. There's certainly no evidence he has. He may simply be incapable of performing that empathetic role.
And what if he becomes defined by and cannot outrun or outgrow a basic fear of what's coming?
Well, it's going to get worse. This is as if King Lear had an iPhone, but that may be unfair to King Lear, I think, as things unfold.
I think he had an Android, but I'm not sure.
Or Cordelia did, anyway. They took it. They didn't take it away in time, which I suspect other people have tried. You know, we're entering a very, a fascinating phase here. Director Mueller is out there. Clearly, part of the drama of the past 8 days or so has been that the president's team received these interrogatories, so they got the first sense of what Director Mueller showed his cards for the first time privately, and we've seen even more erratic behavior. So I don't think it takes a great deal of genius to guess that we're in for an even rougher ride.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.